So Hellblade 2 is only just around the corner, and one thing I've been very curious to see is just how much improvement has been made when it comes to this game compared to the first game. Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice came out 7 years ago now, and obviously with these games both being a bit shorter than the average game, 7 years is quite a long time between an original and a sequel. So today we're going to be looking at all of the improvements and quality of life changes that have been made in Senua's Saga Hellblade 2. Now, one of the first things that stood out to me when it comes to all of the stuff that devs have talked about in the lead up to Hellblade 2 is the fact that there are going to be a lot more enemy types than there were in the first game. One small issue with that first game is that there were realistically only a handful of enemy types, other than obviously the bosses, of course, and even those different enemies did all feel very similar. They all kind of looked a little bit different than each other, and they just kind of had different movesets, but overall it wasn't like they were completely different types of enemies. Now, for me personally, it didn't really matter in that game. It was obviously a much shorter, more narrative driven experience, and although I actually really liked the combat in Hellblade 1, I wasn't really playing it for that exact reason. So I don't think it was a genuine issue when it came to the first game, but it was something that I definitely noticed that pretty much everyone I was fighting felt very similar to all of the other people I was fighting too, and that is something they seem to have definitely tried to focus on when it comes to Hellblade 2, adding much more variety when it comes to those different enemies. They also mentioned in the Xbox showcase, when they kind of first talked in depth about the game, that not only will there be a lot more enemy types, but they will also feel a lot different to each other than they did in the first game, because like I said, even when there were different enemies in that game, they were all relatively the same. They just had very, very minor differences, but it does appear that not only are there going to be more enemy types, but even the current enemy types are going to feel very different compared to how they felt in Hellblade 1. Now, another big improvement that is being made in Hellblade 2 is to do with the animations, and that is pretty crazy to say because the first game already had really insane animations, not only when it came to both the gameplay and the combat, but also for the cinematics and the cutscenes. It is definitely one of the more immersive games when it comes to just the realism of the acting, the cinematography, and realistically just the expressions that Senua was making in essentially every single scene she was in. But from what the devs have mentioned about the game so far, it's been a massive step up in quality when it comes to those exact same animations in Hellblade 2. Now, a lot of this is to do with the combat, but we'll get to that a little bit more in just a second. Mostly what I'm talking about here though is to do with the facial animations, even just stuff like the traversal animations and all that kind of thing. Just the general gameplay does look a hell of a lot better, and again, that is crazy to say considering how well polished the first game was. Ninja Theory have mentioned that they have a completely new studio and a bunch of new equipment that they did not use during the process of making the first game. This was a very small team when they made Hellblade 1, but they've obviously taken a big step up ever since that game because of how well it did, and obviously with that comes a lot more money to spend on stuff like, for example, a completely new studio, as well as all the equipment that comes with that. And like I said, that is definitely going to come across when it comes to the general improvement with little things like the animations, the graphics, and all of those elements that really go into making this a very immersive experience. Now, before we go any further, if you guys are interested in more Hellblade 2 content, be sure to hit that subscribe button and turn on those notifications. There is plenty more content on the way, not only in the lead up to launch, but after launch too, so make sure you don't miss out. Now, I slightly touched on the combat in the previous point, but this is getting a complete overhaul when it comes to Hellblade 2, which again is pretty insane to say considering how well the combat played in the first game, and it was also very polished in that game too. Something crazy that we learned from the Xbox showcase back in January is that the first game took only 2 days to film the entire motion capture for the combat, which in terms of making a game is very, very short compared to most games out there. But they have said that Hellblade 2 has taken over 70 hours of recording just for the combat alone. That is not including the stuff like the cinematics and the cutscenes. And so that absolute crazy step up in the amount of time they've taken with the combat is definitely going to show up in game with how different it's going to feel from the first game. They mentioned that it is pretty much a complete overhaul. They have essentially built the combat from the ground up, taking what worked in the first game, but kind of adding to that, making Senua's sword and her attacks feel a little bit heavier and more deadly, but also being slightly slower than they were in the first game, and realistically just trying to add even more realism to what it had in the first game already. And considering how well the combat played in the first game, I'm so keen to see how this comes across in Hellblade 2. Now, another huge improvement in this game is a pretty basic one, and this is the graphics. This game honestly looks like it could be one of the first true next-gen games in terms of the quality, which is pretty mad to say 4 years after this generation started. Now, the first game already looked absolutely great in my opinion, at least for the time that it came out anyway. Keep in mind that game came out in 2017, and having just played it recently, it still holds up very well. It still genuinely looks like a really high quality current generation game. And so the fact that there has been such a big step up when it comes to the quality and the graphics, not only in the overall graphics, but like the textures, the lighting and all that sort of thing, it is just insane to think how good this game is going to look. And it's obviously very hard to tell when it comes to watching YouTube videos because it isn't quite the same as actually playing it on your TV or your monitor. And I think we're in for an absolute treat when it comes to the overall quality of the graphics in Hellblade 2. Now, the final big improvement actually comes down to the audio, which again is mad to think about, considering I actually think Hellblade 1 had some of the best sound design in all of video games, but they have once again pretty much completely overhauled the audio, adding in binaural and spatial audio for essentially every sound in the entire game. If you guys played Hellblade 1, you'll know that there were the voices in Senua's head, which will obviously be making a return in this game too. Now, those voices did have spatial audio, meaning that if you played the game with a headset, you could clearly tell sometimes the voices were to your side, they were behind you, sometimes in front of you. Wearing a headset in that game does give you kind of like a 3D immersive experience, at least when it comes to the audio, but it was actually only to do with those voices in Senua's head. The rest of the audio in that game was essentially how it is in most other games that you guys would have played, but they have completely overhauled that, and now they have said every single audio element within this game, whether that is the soundtrack, the combat, even just stuff like traversal and all that sort of things, just hearing footsteps, all of that has the potential to be binaural and spatial. It doesn't mean everything is going to be like that, but it does mean that we are in for a much more immersive experience when it comes to the audio, simply because it's not just the voices in Senua's head this time, it is going to be to do with every single element of the game, and I think that is going to sound absolutely mental. This could go down as potentially the best sound design in any game ever made, considering, like I said, I already thought the first game had some of the best sound design that had ever been done at that point. But those are some of the biggest and best improvements or changes coming in Senua's Saga Hellblade 2. I'm interested to hear your thoughts down below, so be sure to leave a comment with all of your thoughts on what you think are the best improvements from all the gameplay and stuff that we've seen surrounding this game. But with that being said, thank you all very much for watching. You guys have a great day, and I'll catch you all in the next one.